Welcome back to Intentional Design. I am so excited that today I'm joined by Josh Kim and Eddie Maloney. We were just chatting before we started the show that we had met or seen each other last, at least, at the Hailstorm Conference up at Southern New Hampshire, back when face-to-face events were a thing. And I'm really grateful to Matthew Raskoff and Kristen Eshelman and James Devaney and I guess it was Brian Fleming, who is our gracious host up there at Southern New Hampshire University. But before we get started and I ask you too many questions, can we start with just introductions? And maybe, Josh, you can go first and tell everybody a little bit about your why you do what you do and what you love most about it.
First of all, Whitney, it's great to spend time with you. Again, it's a small network of people who do what we do, and it's nice to be with you in that network. And I look forward to when we're actually seeing each other again in person. Maybe we can talk about that. I'll just say at Dartmouth, I'm Director of Online Programs and Strategy based in our Teaching and Learning Center, the Dartmouth Center for the Advancement of Learning. I'm a senior scholar at Georgetown. And with Eddie, we do research. We write books and other stuff. We do some consulting. And I think the why is Eddie and I are trying to figure out where higher education might be going together.
Whitney, thanks so much for having us on. I'm Eddie Maloney. I'm the Executive Director of our Center for New Designs in Learning and Scholarship at Georgetown University. I've been there at Georgetown for about 22 years now. And I'm also a faculty member in our Department of English and a new graduate program that I started a few years ago on learning design and technology. And it's really a program that's designed to try to help educate the next generation of folks who are doing the work that we do. And it's been a kind of really interesting process to build a program that thinks about the kinds of things that we've been talking about, we'll be talking about, and have been talking about now for years, especially as we kind of leave this moment or continue this moment around the pandemic. Like Josh, kind of fascinated about the future of higher education, in part because I'm just fascinated about higher education. I think it's an amazing space. It's a space that's and an environment and an ecosystem and a collection of just diverse ideas and people that come together to do really fascinating things. And I've always been fascinated both by the kind of history of higher education, but also about the conversation that happens around any particular topic in higher education. It's often interdisciplinary, it's often complicated, but it's also a kind of past, present, and future thing that I just find really interesting to be part of, and want to make sure that the contribution that we have and that we can make to that conversation is really interesting and hopefully effective and impactful. So it's why I'm here, and it's why it means so much to me.
Well, speaking of impactful contributions, one of the very best resources I've ever stumbled on for inclusive pedagogy and the design of equitable learning experience is actually on the CNDL website.
Oh, thank you. Is that our toolkit?
Yes, it's phenomenal. Can you tell me what inspired you and the team to put that together and what conversations you've had around that topic?
It actually started a couple of years ago in a conference that we had on campus, and some work that happened in that conference to think about where we were going and what we were doing with inclusive pedagogy on campus. Candles, so CNDLS, we take and we call Candles on Campus. So you might help me, I might refer to it just to sort of mention what that is. Has long had inclusive pedagogy as part of its purview. It's kind of one of the core missions that we've had since our beginning, and it really ramped up about 11 years ago when we got a gift that helped to support that work in our what we call our Doyle program. The Inclusive Pedagogy Toolkit started as a kind of way of thinking about how we could reach departments and we could work with folks across campus that would scale in some ways, right? We work a lot of one-on-one. We work in a lot of ways that are through workshops and some of the more common ways that we engage with our faculty and our community. But we knew we were having trouble really reaching both the broader community at Georgetown, but also outside the walls of Georgetown. So the toolkit was the brainchild of a couple of folks at Candles. Jocelyn Lewis was kind of spearheading that for us, and she really put together a team that created, I think, a really thoughtful, dynamic document and set of resources that it's just been really gratifying to see the response throughout higher ed to it. It's been well received in the pod listserv and in other places, and we're just getting a lot of great feedback. And it's going to serve as kind of the core piece to some work we're doing across the entire university to really try to help every department, every academic unit engage with questions of implicit bias, develop a plan around their curriculum, around their culture, and around their pedagogy in the classroom. So we're really excited about it. Thank you for asking.
It's been a fantastic reference for me when I'm working with faculty and talking with leadership about how they can be more specifically focused on equity in online learning. So it's a tremendous resource. For anybody who's listening or watching, we'll make sure to tweet out the link because it's phenomenal. Now, Josh, as I remember from a Higher Ed Geek podcast, you and Eddie, actually met at a number of face-to-face events before you started collaborating together on the books. And so I'm curious, as you think not just about campus returning, but there was this article last week from Flower Darby about her first experience back face-to-face at a conference and how exhausting it was to try to navigate who was ready to have a handshake or a hug or be within 6 feet of one another. How do you think our collaborations at conferences and the innovation that comes from those face-to-face events have been impacted, and what it's going to look like for all of us who are thinking about getting back to that normal?
I have no idea. You're very right that in our field, which is an emerging field, right? I mean, we're emerging as we're trying to integrate what we know about learning science and trying to evolve and change our institutions to align with what we know about how people learn. The way that work has got off the ground, it's been a networked kind of thing. Together, we've been thinking about these challenges now for a number of years, meeting together and talking about how we're going to evolve our colleges and universities, which are old places that have lots and lots of constraints and lots of areas where they need to focus on. And we've been all together trying to, I think, move our ecosystem in this direction. And that's really been a lot of spending time together. So I think we need to do it. I'm not quite sure when or how that's going to look or how it's going to look different. Eddie, have you got this figured out?
I just went to an event. It was a fairly small event, but a few weeks ago, and it was interesting. One, to just be in a room with people that I know. I'm in a lot of spaces where you go to the supermarket, you go out, and you sort of are around people occasionally now. But actually, to be in a room with multiple people that you know and you've met in different contexts, and to kind of figure out how you're going to sort of navigate the social as well as the intellectual becomes a really interesting challenge. And for the most part, we kind of fell back into it. It was probably a few minutes of, do you shake hands? Do you elbow bump? What do you do? Or do you just sort of stand there? And but then you eventually kind of get back into it. And then the conversations really start to flow. And I think I realized how much I missed those opportunities to sit down and have those face-to-face conversations. This is wonderful. It's hard to do these kinds of things regularly when you have to get together in person to do them, right? So I think there are a lot of things that we'll want to keep doing, of course, and everyone's trying to figure out what those things look like. But it seems to me that this is one of those set of sort of activities that we can do as a community. But I think we're going to want to get back to the kind of face-to-face somewhat soon. And I say that not having sat in an auditorium with 300 other people who are listening to a keynote or something. That could just be a very different experience too. So we'll see.
Fascinating to think about all that we've learned about Zoom fatigue, right? And how that has led to the burnout of individual faculty or those that work in learning design. And as leaders of those teams, I'm curious what you're doing from a leadership capacity to help your teams mitigate the burnout or the Zoom fatigue. And as everybody returns to work, will there be some way to blend the ongoing work of your teams? And how do you kind of see that evolving from your view as a leader of those learning design teams?
Yeah, well, I think This may be the answer to every one of your questions, Whitney. We're still trying to figure it out. So we will have a hybrid environment in the fall. Starting in August, we'll have some people who are working on campus 3 days a week, 4 days a week, 1 day a week. I think it'll vary, which means in my mind that everything will be, every meeting will be concurrent in some form. We'll have everyone, will have the capacity for anyone and everyone to zoom in or to be in person. And we're going to have to figure out how to do that. And we've been doing that for a while now anyway, so it's not that complicated. But usually it's 1 or 2 people rather than half the room or half the conversation. And so I think we'll have to inch our way toward what makes most sense and how meetings will be most effective in that kind of conversation. And then to keep in balance, that's that sense of Zoom fatigue and just meeting fatigue in general. I think we're all kind of comfortable with the idea of Zoom fatigue now being something we need to pay attention to. I imagine when we're back on campus, all of our sort of sea legs for being in meetings in person are not quite there either. And we're going to have to figure out how that fatigue is going to affect us. And so doing things like trying to create a lot of flexibility over the summer, I gave everybody kind of a flexible Fridays where they can try to block off meetings, at least maybe focus in on some work that has been sitting on their, in their email or wherever for the week, and they want to get off their table before they go into the weekend, or they just want to take the weekend and start it a little bit earlier. But just to be flexible, to try to be as compassionate as possible, to be understanding, and still recognize we have a lot of work to do, and try to find that right balance. So I think we're figuring it out, and it'll take some time to figure out. I don't think we know what it's going to look like.
It's a great question, Whitney, and we'd love to hear your thoughts about this as well, because we're trying to figure this out. As Eddie said, everything is going to be mixed, and what we need to be is flexible. What we know is, unless you're incredibly intentional about meetings where some people are on campus face-to-face and some people are remote, the experience for those remote people is almost always worse. They don't have they don't get the nonverbal cues. They're not as included. It's just not it's not great, or it hasn't been great for those people who have been zooming in while people are together on campus. So this is an opportunity for us to really design our interactions and think about how we can make those experiences truly equal. There's some things I think we know to do with those. We know that in normally in meetings, the people with the highest status or the longest tenure or other variables, they tend to talk the most, right? And people who are maybe more junior or more marginalized for whatever reason aren't able to contribute. So we know with our Zoom meetings that I think there's been more awareness of trying to have the contributions be based on people's power of ideas and not their rank in a hierarchy. But we'll have to be careful to guard against that not coming back. Not that it's totally went away, but I think we're all more aware of that. I think the other part of this is that we have to get to a point where people who work in higher education feel they can make their choices about how it works best for them to work. And there's going to be real challenges in doing that because we have a lot of work to get done. And sometimes it's just better to have people face to face, but sometimes not. So I think there's going to be a lot of renegotiation of all of our roles within higher education that's been totally upended during COVID. For a sociologist, it's very interesting how those dynamics will play out when we come back together.
The end solution seems to be on both of your accounts, some sort of blend, I guess. And that's what I keep reading about just the future of higher education at large, right? Is that at some point the expectations have changed around how much technology would be used in teaching and learning. And while we may not go all the way to all learning being online, I don't think that would ever happen. But certainly there's going to be expectations of blended as we go forward in the future. And when I look at some of the things that you've written, I know you guys are really focused on innovation in your writing, but you've really pushed back on this notion of disruption. The book that you guys wrote, Learning Innovation in the Future of Higher Education, really digs into Christensen's theory of disruptive innovation as a force of change in higher education. And I wonder if COVID has been a more disruptive force than the ed tech startups and things of that nature that I think Christensen kind of alluded to. I'm curious what your take is on that.
So we were very critical in Learning Innovation, the Future of Higher Education, of using the framework of disruption theory to either understand or predict how higher education is going to change. We made an argument that we need to actually use theoretical frameworks that are appropriate for higher education, and we made an argument about for all the reasons why that framework really doesn't fit. I would still argue, it'd be interesting what Eddie has to say, that I think we need to not rely on business theories or theoretical frameworks that were conceived in other contexts to understand where we're going to go after this pandemic. I mean, you could certainly say that COVID was disruptive, but I don't think it quite fits in with disruptive innovation theory. One thing that we've learned is that colleges and universities that had invested in the organizational changes necessary to advance learning, to really bring educational developers and instructional designers, those people working with faculty on residential and online learning, were better prepared for the disruptions of COVID, right? So I think the question Eddie and I were talking about this is, what are our campuses going to do in the years, coming out of COVID, to build on some of those investments, but really accelerate them from what we've learned from these past 18 months.
Yeah, I think that's right, Josh. I don't know that a business model tends to work really well with higher ed, just given the complexity of the system that we are part of. One of the things that we talk about in the book that I think is true is that we are not necessarily in competition with each other. We're often trying to help figure out how to support each other as part of a larger community of a service that is both for the civic good. It's also about the individual. It's also about a common understanding of knowledge, or the whole set of activities that are really not about any one particular institution's success versus another institution's success, or the industry itself in relationship to other industries. And certainly from Christensen's perspective, the idea of ed tech firms coming in and trying to disrupt that was a potential threat, but they, just really sort of the role that they played in the larger ecosystem was so small. It seemed, I think, for both of us to be a misguided assumption about what higher ed is and how higher ed has functioned for, well, almost millennia at this point. But but I do think COVID has certainly raised our awareness of a number of things that could potentially lead to change. And I think that's where we're going to have to really pay attention and be proactive about it. The metaphor I've been using is of a pendulum. I think we swung really far, really fast in one direction. Everyone had to figure out what they were going to do for the past year. It's swinging really, really fast back in the other direction. Everyone wants to be back on campus. And there's, that's how pendulums work. The momentum in one direction is going to carry forward in the other direction. And I think we're going to see that in the fall, especially. Everyone's is clamoring for getting back to campus and having that in-person experience, and the value of that in-person experience, which I don't think either of us would question. But my guess is that after about a month or so, things are going to start swinging and maybe even leveling into some version of a center. And we'll find students start to ask for some of the flexibility, some of the opportunities, some of the advantages that they saw over the course of the past year. As complex as it was, we'll see faculty starting to recognize that the things that they found easier to do in Zoom will be meaningful, and they'll want to actually go back to that experience. They'll find some of the digital tools to be really powerful, some of the changes that they made to their pedagogy and so on. So I think we'll see change. I'm hoping we'll see change, but I think it has to be intentional. I don't think it's disruptive in the sense of some other force coming in and forcing us to make change. But I think it will be, it has the potential to be to be lost. I think if we're not intentional and proactive about it, I think we could certainly let the pendulum end up on one side and get caught up there, and that'll be a problem. And my guess is that a lot of schools that will happen too. They'll just go back to what they saw as the 2019 version of the fall, and they'll try to recreate that. But I do think a lot of schools will recognize the opportunity here, the challenges, of course, as well. And if we're smart about it, and we do this work intentionally and meaningfully, I think we can learn a lot. We can understand what we need to do to evolve and grow into the institutions that we think we need to be for the next couple decades at least and beyond.
Which leads me to kind of the big question we've all been grappling with for the last 18 months almost, which is the quality question, right? So the institutions that had to pivot in short order, those teams did a remarkable job to be able to support faculty in the moment. But we all know that you have to be very intentional in the design of online learning programs to get to quality, to get to equity, to address the elephant in the room, right? Make sure that what we're designing is actually thoughtful and student-centered. And in that moment, that Zoom U pivot for so many institutions, quality had to take a sideline because it was about keeping the momentum, finishing the term, and being resilient. And I think, definitely I want to applaud institutions who did that. But now we're in this quandary of if there wasn't time in that moment to develop something quality for those institutions that didn't already have programs, what do they do now? How do they go from that experience that they had, and rather than a pendulum swing full scale back to totally face-to-face, is there something in the middle for them? What does that middle ground look like? Is there quality that brings some technology into teaching and learning that stays? As you think about the best of what we've experienced, what sticks around, Eddie?
Yeah, well, again, we're trying to figure that out. Sorry, might need to be a t-shirt. I think so one thing we know, I think generally from research, which is pretty limited, but it's there, that people learn better in kind of multimodal ways to gain access to information from a variety of different ways, rather than one singular approach. And I think technology plays a role in giving us access to information and understanding and skill sets and practices that can help to augment and vary what we had with primarily in-person instruction. And so I imagine we'll want to hang on to and start to explore different ways of trying to build on some of those capacities that faculty were able to design and develop over the past year, and whether that's lecture capture to help deliver pre-recorded lectures so students can watch those in different formats, or making sure we have transcripts for things and giving students access to digital materials, and for courses that never flipped the classroom to see those, that flipping of the classroom to shifting time of a classroom to be meaningful as well. But we also learned a lot about our students and the inequities that our students face, and I'm sure we'll want to hang on to that understanding, and how that understanding affects our students' ability to feel both a sense of belonging on campus, but also to do their best work on campus. And so the things that we learned about our students and we learned about ourselves as teachers and as members of a community, I hope will also be the thing that we'll hang on to. And that, again, can be mitigated, maybe can be augmented, can be addressed in certain kinds of ways with technologies. We know, for example, that our faculty felt, and I think our students felt, that virtual office hours were just a much better use of that kind of engagement between faculty and students, rather than in-person office hours that students tended not to show up to. And so even something as simple as that, which I hear over and over again that our faculty and others want to hang on to and continue, will help to build those kinds of relationships that even on campus are not necessarily there. And so figuring out how to marry that with the in-person, on-campus, engagements with students that just happen to, be part of walking across campus and bumping into someone. And, how do we actually figure out the right balance between those things? I think we're all going to be trying to figure out as we move forward.
Yeah, right. That is the big question coming out of this. What can we take away that's positive and learn, so we can advance learning. And one thing Eddie talks about a lot, which I think is really good to keep at the center here, is that a quality higher education is one that's co-created with the faculty, the professor, and the learner. That together they come together. That education is not a product. It's not something that should be consumed. So maybe one way as we come out of this time is for us to not talk about technology for a little bit, and to talk about together as educators and learners what this experience has been like. And one of the kind of different things that have come in the past 18 months is I think professors and students have gotten different views about each other. We've seen how complicated our lives are, and we're all trying to kind of manage and get through this. And in the best classes during the pandemic, my sense was that the professors and students kind of put the normal ways of doing things aside and tried to figure out, okay, how can we make this experience as meaningful and impactful together? And that seems like a pretty good model coming forward. I think we might have to leave aside some things that we thought we needed so much, all the content we need to cover and all the high stakes exams, and maybe we can really bring in this pedagogy of care that we've tried to pervade in our institutions. I hope that stays. I hope that sticks.
There's been a lot of trauma-informed, whether it was pedagogy or learning design, but a lot of focus on mental health and wellness. Are there any initiatives on either of your institutions' campuses focused on mental health and wellness as we go forward, as students return to campus in the fall?
I mean, I'll just start in the Dartmouth context. That context of student wellness and also really faculty wellness, like that now pervades all of our discussions. I mean, part of this is I think, as Eddie talked about, how the pandemic both revealed and exacerbated inequalities. Now the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, that is so central to the work we're doing and wrapped up in all of our initiatives. It's not kind of like an add-on. It is deeply tied into the DNA of the work of advancing learning. I think when you think about it in that way, issues of wellness for all of our learners, and particularly the ones that are the least advantaged, really come to the forefront in everything that we do. So, I think that is, those kind of issues have long been discussed in teaching and learning centers, but now they're pervading across the institution with many more stakeholders. I think that's potentially positive.
Yeah, we've had at Georgetown an initiative we call our Engelhardt Initiative that's focused on student well-being in the classroom, and we try to help faculty develop curricular infusion models where students are actually thinking about and engaged with our healthcare professionals, with the faculty, and the course content to really kind of focus in on just the sense of student well-being and what it means for students to be part of a community that we have at Georgetown. We've been doing that now for 17 years. It's been a long-standing project. It's also the case that Wellbeing is one of our president's key initiatives, and so it's something that he's been paying attention to for a long time as well. And so we see it as a long-standing conversation. It's, I think, one of the things that allowed us not only to pay attention to Wellbeing over the past year, as we were kind of moving into that remote mode, but to do so with some sense of depth and care, and that we've had these resources, we've had this engagement. Interestingly, from many perspectives, I think, but at least from mine, the richest data that we've had about student learning and student sense of engagement came from that project. Everywhere else, in terms of what students were able to do and how they were able to what the difference was in moving to their kind of emergency remote mode was really hard to track because we didn't have any baseline data. And we didn't really know what student engagement looked like over the course of a semester. So when we saw it dipping in different kinds of ways over the course of the semester in remote mode, we didn't know if that was normal. We assumed it was probably normal, that by the time you get to midterms, everyone's sense of engagement is dropped down significantly. But we didn't even know where the baseline was and how to talk about that. But with our Engelhard project, and we've been tracking that for a long time, and so we had some sense of data. Or some sense of how our students' sense of engagement occurred, not throughout the semester, but at least in terms of their sense of engagement in those courses. And that was really helpful. And I think it's crucial that we pay attention to where our students are, and we pay attention to where our faculty are and where our staff are as well. It's a campus community that does this work. And that sense of well-being, not simply from a kind of HR perspective that we often think about well-being, but really from that perspective of this is what makes for a productive and engaged community to do the work that they're there to do. If they're not embracing that sense of health and well-being, then they're fundamentally not going to be successful students. And in fact, they're not going to be successful teachers, and our staff are not going to be able to support the institution in the way that they're designed to do so, or they're asked to do so.
You bring up a really important point, Eddie, that I hadn't thought about in a while. And that's that we haven't really been tracking what's going on inside face-to-face classrooms. And so when we talked about quality earlier, we've been thinking about quality in the online arena for a really long time and having these conversations about quality from a learning design perspective, a teaching and learning perspective, thinking about how we apply learning sciences. This has been an ongoing conversation for a long time, but this isn't a conversation that's been central to face-to-face teaching. It has truly been central to online. And without that baseline data for all these other institutions, they really were in the dark. It was this eye-opening moment, if you will, right? So I'm curious, do you think that there'll be reflections on how we can now track or better understand student engagement in the face-to-face environment as well?
Yeah, I know that's something that we're doing at Georgetown. We're going to be tracking and trying to understand student sense of engagement in the fall semester. We're going to be trying to understand how that maps against what we saw in the remote mode. My guess is that it'll be actually a pretty similar curve, or I don't even know what the right version of the graph will be, but it'll probably follow a similar path. I'm sure students and faculty are going to be really excited to be back on campus in the beginning, and then things are going to start kicking in, the amount of work, the overload. Some of the things that we saw for the past year was just really this sense of being burned out and overwhelmed, and the amount of work felt exhausting in a variety of different kinds of ways. And I'm sure that was the case for all sorts of reasons, given the environment, given where we found ourselves. But I'm guessing that our students feel that often when they're in the classroom, and we'll see some of that as well. I don't know; it's an intuition at this point, but I imagine that'll be the case. And so, but we'll try to find out. I think it's important to do so. And just one thing, we've been trying to do that for a long time. There hasn't been the sort of the appetite to do that, and I think there now is, and that's maybe one positive of the difficulty of the last year plus.
Yeah, and Whitney, I'll push back gently on your some of your assumptions. I mean, one of the things that we documented in our book, Learning Innovation and the Future of Higher Education, is that over the past decade or so, many institutions have had really large-scale programs to redesign foundational courses, intro courses. And those are face-to-face largely. And those redesigns had learning science and active learning, student engagement at the center of their work. Part of those foundational courses programs were redesigning the courses, partly redesigning the classrooms that they took place in to move from tiered to active learning classrooms. So one of the arguments that Eddie and I make in the book is that this is really happening, right? And it's kind of invisible, right? Because we don't really see all these course redesign programs, but there has been lots of efforts, and lots of classrooms have been redesigned, and lots of intro classes and gateway courses have been redesigned. Part of the arguments that we make is that we need to figure out a way to mark those successes and celebrate them, and build on them, so that if a new provost comes in or a new president, those kind of priorities to do these course redesigns, that they don't fall off, and that we're able to extend those, across everything we do. So I think we have a good start. The question will be, coming out of COVID, with I think everyone everyone's still really exhausted. Like, I don't think anyone feels like they really had a summer to get back, because we never had the transition. If you do online learning, it's still kind of going, and many residential campuses. Will we have that kind of energy that we need to take what we've learned during COVID and to look what's gone before and really think about, okay, this is like a once in a generation moment to really accelerate the reinvention of teaching and learning? And that, to me, that's an open question about, really, will any of us, faculty and staff, and everyone's just exhausted still. And I wish we could just sort of all go away for August.
Interesting take, and I appreciate you correcting my assumptions. I shouldn't make such a sweeping generalization that there's no data about the face-to-face class. I just meant the microscope has really been focused on online. And I had read, I think you wrote about the Coursera IPO and the S1 document that gets created about transparency and the lack of transparency sometimes about risks and things of that nature. And going forward, how might higher education kind of illuminate or share some of those things that are happening inside their institutions? It's kind of a fascinating take on that. If anybody hasn't read that particular piece in Inside Higher Ed, it's worth a read. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time today. This was awesome. Great to catch up with you both and to hear your perspectives on all the things we don't really know yet, because we're really truly building the plane while we're flying it as we go back to campus this fall. So thanks again for your time.
Thanks, Whitney.
Thank you, Whitney.